Imagine standing at the bottom of a valley in 1892. The air smells like wet pine and river mud. Behind you, a wall of stacked timber rises 40 feet into the sky, holding back a lake that shouldn't exist. Millions of gallons of water press against hand-hewn logs, and somewhere above you, a man with an axe is about to cut a single rope. When that rope snaps, you have approximately 90 seconds to reach high ground. If you don't make it, they won't find your body. They rarely did. This is the story of splash dams, the wooden dams that could flood entire valleys on command. The forgotten engineering marvels that moved more timber than any railroad, killed more men than any sawmill, and reshaped the rivers of America in ways we're still trying to undo today. For nearly a century, these temporary dams transformed peaceful creeks into weapons of mass transportation. One moment, a valley held a quiet stream. The next, a roaring wall of water carried 1 million logs downstream at speeds that could crush a horse and rider before they heard it coming. The men who built them were engineers without degrees. The men who operated them were gamblers betting their lives against physics. And the men who died in them were forgotten before the water settled. This is how America moved its forests to market. And this is what it cost. To understand splash dams, you first need to understand a problem that seems almost quaint today. You've cut down a tree? Congratulations? Now what? In the 1840s and 1850s, logging operations pushed deeper into American wilderness. The trees they found were magnificent. White pines that took 4 men to wrap their arms around. Douglas firs that had been growing since the Crusades. Redwoods so tall that looking up at them made men dizzy. But magnificence creates its own problems. A single old-growth white pine could weigh 20,000 pounds. A Douglas fir, twice that. These trees fell in valleys and mountainsides miles from any road, in terrain so rough that horses couldn't navigate it and oxen simply refused. You could cut all the timber you wanted. Without a way to move it, you might as well leave it standing. The first attempts at log transport were brutally simple. Teams of oxen dragged individual logs along skid roads. I greased paths through the forest where timber could slide toward collection points. The work was slow and expensive. A good team might move 12 logs per day over rough terrain. A logging camp producing thousands of logs per week needed something better. Railroads were expensive. Building a logging railroad cost approximately $10,000 per mile in 1880 currency. That's nearly $300,000 in today's money, per mile, through mountain terrain, as for trees that might be exhausted in 5 years. The math didn't work for most operations, so the logging companies looked at what they already had: rivers, streams, creeks that ran downhill toward sawmills and markets, water that flowed for free and asked nothing in return except that you respect its power. The problem was timing. Rivers ran high in spring when snowmelt swelled them, but logging happened year-round. By summer, those same rivers shrank to trickles that couldn't float a canoe, let alone a 40-foot log. You could stockpile timber all winter, but if the spring melt came late or light, your log sat rotting on the banks while your sawmill stood idle. And so someone, probably a forgotten genius in Maine or Pennsylvania, asked a simple question. If we can't bring the logs to the water when it's high, can we bring the water to the logs when we need it? The answer was the splash dam, and it changed everything. The concept was elegantly brutal. You find a narrow point in a stream or river, you build a dam across it. Not a permanent dam like you'd see on a major river today, but a temporary wooden structure designed to hold water just long enough to create a small lake. Behind that dam, water accumulates. Days pass, weeks, the lake grows. Meanwhile, your logging crews are dragging cut timber to the water's edge, rolling logs into the growing reservoir until the surface is covered bank to bank with floating wood. When you've got enough logs and enough water, you trigger the release. In the most common design, workers would cut a restraining rope or knock out key support timbers. The dam would partially collapse, and everything behind it would surge forward. Not just water, not just logs, everything: rocks, mud, debris, smaller trees that had fallen into the reservoir. all of it compressed into a wall of destruction that roared downstream faster than a man could run. They called it a splash. The name doesn't do it justice. The engineering of splash dams evolved over decades, and by the 1880s, the designs had become remarkably sophisticated for structures built entirely of wood. The most common type was the crib dam, constructed from interlocking squared timbers stacked like a massive log cabin laid on its side. Workers would fell trees near the dam site and square them with broadexes until they had timbers roughly 12 inches on each side. These were notched at the ends, on Lincoln log style, and stacked in alternating directions to create a lattice framework. The interior was filled with rocks and gravel for weight, and the upstream face was covered with planking to make it watertight. A typical splash dam stood between 20 and 40 feet tall and might stretch 200 feet across a valley. Construction took anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on size and location. The crews worked without safety equipment of any kind. Men balanced on narrow timbers over rushing water, swinging axes and driving spikes. The engineering calculations were done by eye and experience. Dam builders could look at a valley and estimate the water pressure per foot of dam height, the timber strength needed to resist that pressure, and the volume of water required to drive a given number of logs a given distance downstream. They did these calculations without paper, without formal training, without the engineering tables that would later standardize such work. When they got it right, the dams held for years, releasing load after load of timber. When they got it wrong, men died. Falls during construction were common. The casualty rates during dam construction aren't well documented because logging companies didn't keep detailed records of worker injuries. They weren't required to. Nobody made them. What we do know is that the work was considered among the most dangerous in logging, which was already the most dangerous industry in America. That should tell you something. The critical component of any splash dam was the release mechanism, and here the engineers showed genuine ingenuity. Most dams used what they called a sluice gate. A section of the dam, usually near the center and bottom, was designed to open on command. The simplest version was the bear trap gate, and 2 heavy planks hinged at the bottom of a central opening. When closed, water pressure held them shut. When workers cut the restraining cables from above, the planks would fall forward and water would blast through the opening with tremendous force. More sophisticated designs used trip gates that could be operated from the shore. A system of cables and pulleys allowed workers to trigger the release from a safe distance. The definition of safe distance was, of course, a matter of considerable debate among men who had seen colleagues die within inches of supposed safety. Some operations used what they called a quick release system. The dam was held together by a series of wooden pins or iron spikes driven through key joints. When the release crew knocked out these pins in sequence, the dam would unfold like a house of cards, releasing its entire contents in seconds rather than minutes. The quick release systems were faster, but far more dangerous. They required crews to work on the dam face itself, removing structural elements while millions of gallons of water pressed against the remaining timbers. One wrong move, one pin removed out of sequence, and the dam would fail with workers still on it. Some dams were designed to release gradually through multiple gates. Others were built to fail catastrophically all at once. The choice depended on the terrain downstream, the amount of timber to be moved, and the river's capacity to handle the surge. Nobody asked the rivers for their opinion. Nobody asked the fish. Nobody asked the communities downstream who would bear the consequences of decisions made by men they would never meet. The financial calculations were simple. A splash dam cost perhaps $2,000 to construct. It could move timber worth $50,000 or more to market. The profit margins were enormous compared to any alternative. If the dam failed, you built another one. If workers died, you hired more workers. The math always worked out in favor of the dam. When a splash dam released, the physics were spectacular and terrible. Water stored at elevation contains potential energy. Release it suddenly, and that potential becomes kinetic, violent kinetic. A medium-sized splash dam might hold back 5 million gallons of water. When released through a 20-foot opening, shows that water reaches velocities of 15 to 20 miles per hour within seconds. But water isn't the only thing moving. Behind the dam, you've got tens of thousands of logs floating on the surface. When the water level drops, those logs move with it. They accelerate through the dam opening, often faster than the water itself because they're being pushed from behind while being pulled from the front. The first logs through acted like battering rams. They hit any obstacle in the stream with forces that could shatter boulders and uproot 100-year-old trees from the banks. Observers described the sound as unlike anything else in nature, a roaring crash that combined thunder, explosions, and the screaming of wood against wood. One foreman in Michigan described it this way in an 1887 letter to his brother. "You hear it before you see it? The ground shakes like an earthquake is coming. Then the water, brown and full of wood, moving faster than a horse can run. And the noise. Lord, the noise, like every storm you've ever heard happening all at once." The wave height downstream varied based on the valley configuration. In narrow canyons, the surge could reach 15 feet or higher. In broader valleys, it spread out and dropped to perhaps 5 feet. Either way, anyone caught in the open was dead. They called the wave the head. Experienced loggers could hear it coming from miles away. A low rumble that grew until the ground itself seemed to shake. Smart men climbed to high ground immediately. Foolish men tried to gauge the distance. Dead men miscalculated. Behind the head came the drive itself. Thousands upon thousands of logs racing downstream in a chaos of spinning, crashing, jamming wood. A single log weighing 1,000 pounds and traveling at 15 miles per hour carried enough momentum to kill anything it struck. And there were 10,000 of them, and sometimes 50,000, sometimes more. The log drives could last hours or days depending on the distance to the destination. Rivers that had been sleepy streams became industrial highways. Entire watersheds transformed into transportation networks. Towns along the river route would hear the drive coming and gather on bridges and hillsides to watch the timber pass, a spectacle of industrial power that seemed almost supernatural. And somewhere in that chaos, men were working, standing on moving logs, jumping between floating timber, pushing, prodding, and breaking apart jams before they could become catastrophic. This was the job of the river driver, and it was the deadliest occupation in America. River drivers were the elite of logging operations. They were paid more than fellers, more than teamsters, more than anyone else in the woods. They earned every penny in blood. The work required perfect balance on surfaces that never stopped moving. A log in the water doesn't sit still. It rotates, it dips, it slides against other logs with forces that can crush limbs or throw a man into the water without warning. Drivers wore caulked boots with sharp metal spikes on the soles. These provided grip on wet wood, but came with their own hazards. Step wrong, and you could drive a spike through your own foot. Fall in those same spikes could tear open anyone you landed on. Men learned to roll when they fell, by tucking their feet to avoid gashing their partners. The boots made a distinctive sound on the logs, a sharp clicking that experienced drivers used to track each other's position even when spray and chaos blocked their vision. When the clicking stopped suddenly, everyone knew someone had gone into the water. River drivers had their own vocabulary, their own songs, their own codes of conduct. They looked out for each other because nobody else would. When a man went into the water, his partners dropped everything to pull him out. When a jam started forming, everyone knew their role without discussion. The best crews moved like single organisms, anticipating each other's actions, compensating for each other's mistakes. The bonds formed in that work lasted lifetimes. Men who had driven together would recognize each other decades later, would buy each other drinks, would tell stories about the drives they'd survived. The shared experience of constant danger created relationships that civilian life couldn't match, but those same bonds made the losses harder. When a partner vanished into a broken jam, you carried that with you forever. The primary tool was the peavey, a long wooden handle with a metal spike at the end and a hinged hook near the tip. With a peavey, an experienced driver could control logs 10 times his weight, spinning them, pushing them, linking them together, or breaking them apart. The tool was invented specifically for river driving and hasn't changed significantly since the 1850s. You can still buy one today, though few people alive know how to use it properly. But the real skill was reading the water. A log jam could form in seconds when 2 or more logs wedged against an obstruction. If the jam wasn't broken immediately, more logs piled up behind it. Then more. A jam could grow from 2 logs to 2,000 in less than a minute. The pressure behind a major jam was almost inconceivable. Tens of thousands of pounds of floating timber pressing forward against stationary logs. The structure would groan and shift, timbers cracking under stress that could snap them like matchsticks. Standing on a jam was like standing on a bomb that might detonate at any moment. Breaking jams was where men died. The technique was called picking the key log. Every jam had 1 log, sometimes 2, whose removal would collapse the entire structure. Finding that log required experience that couldn't be taught. Removing it required courage that couldn't be faked. The driver would walk out onto the jam, peavey in hand, while his partners watched from the bank. He'd study the pile, looking for the stress points, the log that held everything together. Then he'd start working, prying, twisting, trying to free the key piece. Sometimes he'd be out there for minutes, sometimes hours. The jam groaning and settling beneath him. New logs crashing into the pile from upstream, every timber shifting and adjusting as the pressure changed. When the jam broke, it broke all at once. Logs that had been stationary suddenly launched in every direction. The driver had maybe 2 seconds to leap for clear water and swim for his life. If he went under the moving timber, nobody could save him. They didn't recover bodies from broken jams. The current was too fast, the debris too thick. Men simply vanished. Their partners would find their peavey floating downstream, sometimes with the leather wrist strap still attached. That was the only funeral they got. The annual death toll from river driving was never accurately recorded because different states, different companies, and different eras kept records in different ways. Some didn't keep records at all. But estimates suggest that 1 river driver died for every million board feet of lumber transported. A single large drive might move 50 million board feet. Do the math. Then sit with what that number means. The most dangerous moment of any splash dam operation was the release itself. Workers had to trigger the mechanism and then escape before the water caught them. This sounds simpler than it was. Remember that many dams were in remote canyons with steep sides. The men operating the release mechanisms often had limited escape routes. They would trigger the sluice and then sprint for ladders or scramble up rocky slopes while water surged toward their heels. A man named Patrick Doyle worked splash dams on the Kennebec River in Maine for 11 seasons. In an interview recorded by a local historian in 1923, he described the moment of release. You'd hear the timbers groan first, then the water. It made a sound like nothing else. Like the river was breathing out all at once, and you ran. You didn't think about running? Your legs just went. Because if they didn't, you'd be part of the drive, rolling downstream with the rest of the wood. Doyle lost 2 brothers to splash dam work. One drowned during a jam break. The other was struck by a log that came loose during a release and traveled 70 feet through the air before hitting him in the chest. He survived the impact but died 3 days later from internal bleeding. There was no doctor within 20 miles. The company paid for his burial, which was considered unusual generosity. In 1903, a splash dam on Clearwater River in Idaho released prematurely when a support timber failed during inspection. 3 workers were on the dam face when it gave way. 2 managed to leap to safety. The third, a man named Patrick Sullivan, was carried over the falls with the first surge of water. His body was found 11 miles downstream, wedged between logs. Similar accidents happened regularly. A poorly secured rope, a rotten timber that looked sound, a miscommunication between the release crew and the spotters. The variables were endless, and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. Some operations used dynamite to trigger releases. This was considered safer for the workers, but created its own problems. Too little powder, and the dam might not breach properly. Too much, and the entire structure could fragment, sending heavy timbers downstream as projectiles. In 1891, a dynamite-triggered release on the Penobscot River in Maine sent a 20-foot squared timber through the wall of a downstream sawmill. The timber traveled nearly half a mile at high velocity. It killed a mill worker named Thomas Brennan, who was standing in what everyone had assumed was a safe area. The investigation concluded that the blast had been excessive. No charges were filed. The company paid Brennan's widow $40. That was considered generous. The scale of splash dam operations is difficult to comprehend today. At their peak in the 1880s and 1890s, hundreds of splash dams operated simultaneously across the American timber regions. Maine alone had over 100 active splash dams on various rivers. Michigan had nearly as many. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the entire Great Lakes timber region relied on them for bulk transport. The Pacific Northwest, just beginning its timber boom, was building them as fast as crews could cut the wood. On Washington and Oregon rivers that had never seen anything larger than a canoe suddenly carried floods of Douglas fir, destined for sawmills in Portland and Seattle and beyond. A single large operation might use multiple splash dams in sequence. The first dam would release and drive logs to a collection point where a second dam had been creating its own reservoir. That second dam would release hours or days later, catching the logs from above and driving them farther downstream. 3 or 4 dams could extend transport distances by dozens of miles. The coordination required was remarkable for an era without radio communication. Riders on horseback carried messages between dam sites. Observers stationed at high points used signal flags or mirror flashes to indicate timing. The entire operation depended on precise sequencing that, if disrupted, could strand logs between dams or worse, catch downstream crews in a release they weren't expecting. The largest recorded splash dam releases moved over 1 million logs in a single drive. Picture that for a moment. 1 million logs, each weighing hundreds or thousands of pounds, moving downstream in a continuous flood that lasted for days. The rivers ran brown with bark and debris. Fish populations were obliterated. The riverbanks were scoured bare. Nobody cared. There was timber to move, and the nation was hungry for wood. And the men who worked these operations came from everywhere and nowhere. Immigrants who spoke little English, farm boys escaping poverty, drifters looking for winter work, veterans of other dangerous trades who had run out of other options. French Canadians dominated the main operations, bringing skills developed in the timber regions of Quebec. Scandinavians filled the crews in Minnesota and Wisconsin, men from Norway and Sweden who understood cold and timber from their homelands. Where Irish laborers worked everywhere, taking the jobs that other groups avoided, which in logging meant the most dangerous positions. They slept in bunkhouses that held 40 men or more, stacked in wooden bunks 3 high. They ate beans and salt pork and bread that was more weevil than wheat. They worked 12 hours or more during the drive season, sleeping in shifts, eating on their feet, knowing that every moment of inattention could be their last. The camp smelled like men who hadn't bathed in weeks because they hadn't. Water was for drinking and for driving logs. Personal hygiene was a luxury nobody had time for during the drive season. The logging companies provided nothing beyond basic food and shelter. Medical care was non-existent. Injured workers were given a ticket home if they were lucky. If they weren't lucky, they were left at the nearest town with whatever cash they had in their pockets. And many died in rooming houses miles from anyone who knew their real names. Life insurance wasn't offered because no insurance company would write policies for splash dam workers. The actuarial tables couldn't accommodate a profession where drowning was considered normal and being crushed by logs was routine. The very concept of risk assessment broke down when applied to men who worked on moving timber in raging water. These men didn't complain much, at least not in ways that got recorded. They took the wages, they did the work, they died or they didn't. Those who survived one season came back for another because the alternatives were working in coal mines or starving on failing farms or watching their families go hungry. America was built on their broken bodies. We owe them more than we'll ever repay. The environmental impact of splash dams was catastrophic, though nobody used that word at the time. Rivers that had taken millennia to establish their courses were reshaped in hours. Stream beds that had been stable for centuries were scoured to bedrock. Every splash dam release was essentially a flash flood. The surge stripped away soil and vegetation from the banks. It filled pools with sediment. It destroyed the gravel beds where salmon and trout had spawned for generations. Fish couldn't survive the drives themselves. The wall of water was lethal, but the logs were worse. Fish caught in a log drive were ground apace between thousands of tons of moving timber. Those that escaped the logs were stranded in pools that dried up when the water level dropped. Native American communities who had depended on these fisheries for thousands of years watched their food sources disappear in a single season. They had no legal recourse. They had no voice in the courts. They watched as the rivers that had sustained their ancestors became industrial sluices that sustained only profit. Studies from the 1920s found that rivers subjected to regular splash dam operations had lost 80 to 90% of their native fish populations. Some species disappeared entirely from watersheds where they had been abundant for thousands of years. The loss was permanent. You cannot restore what has been completely destroyed. The effects persisted long after the dams were gone. Stream channels widened and shallowed. Deep pools that had provided fish habitat filled with gravel. The organic debris that once fed stream ecosystems was replaced with compacted mud. Some rivers have still not recovered. Over a century later, fisheries biologists can look at a stream and identify where splash dams operated based on the continued degradation of the habitat. The damage is legible in the landscape, written in silt and absence. Nobody was held responsible for this destruction. The logging companies took their timber and moved on. The rivers were left to heal themselves as best they could. Many are still trying. Not every splash dam release went according to plan. Sometimes the physics exceeded the engineering, and the results were spectacular in the worst possible way. The most common failure mode was the catastrophic breach. A dam designed to release through a controlled sluice would instead collapse entirely, sending the full weight of water and timber downstream in a single uncontrolled surge. In 1885, a splash dam on the Chippewa River in Wisconsin failed during the night. Workers camped downstream had no warning. The wall of water and logs swept through their sleeping area at approximately 3 a.m. 14 men died. Some bodies were never recovered. And the company expressed regret and continued operations the following season with a newly constructed dam on the same site. The investigation blamed rotten timbers in the dam's base structure. The company argued that the workers should have camped farther from the river. Both statements were probably true. Neither addressed the fundamental problem that splash dams were inherently unpredictable devices operating in environments that humans didn't fully understand. And similar disasters occurred regularly. In 1879, a dam failure on the Androscoggin River in Maine killed 8. In 1893, a premature release on the Clearwater in Idaho killed 5. In 1901, a catastrophic breach on the Grays River in Washington killed an unknown number of Native American fishermen who had been working below the dam. Their deaths weren't investigated because they weren't considered important enough to count. Their names were never recorded. Their families received nothing. The worst single splash dam disaster may have occurred in 1897 on the Dead River in Maine, though records are incomplete. A dam holding back an unusually large reservoir failed during spring flooding. The combined surge overtopped a downstream dam, which also failed. The cascading flood destroyed a sawmill, several houses, and a church. The death toll was reported as anywhere from 12 to over 30, depending on which newspaper you believed. The town of Flagstaff, downstream of the destruction, never fully recovered. Buildings that survived the flood stood damaged for years. Families moved away. Businesses closed. The community that had existed before the flood was gone, replaced by something diminished and fearful. It was eventually abandoned entirely when a permanent dam flooded the site decades later. The ghosts moved on with the living. By 1900, splash dams were already becoming obsolete in many regions. Not because of the deaths, not because of the environmental damage, not because anyone had developed a conscience about the destruction. They were obsolete because railroads had become cheap enough to replace them. Logging railroads could operate year-round, regardless of water levels. They could carry timber uphill as well as down. They didn't destroy the watersheds that powered downstream sawmills, and critically, they didn't require the specialized workforce that splash dam operations demanded. A railroad could be operated by men who had never seen a log drive. A splash dam required expertise that took years to develop and killed many of those who developed it. The economics favored rail even before the safety considerations entered the equation, which meant the safety considerations never really entered the equation at all. The transition was gradual. Operations in accessible terrain switched to rail first. More remote areas kept using splash dams into the 1920s and even later. The last commercial splash dam operations in the continental United States probably occurred in the 1930s, though documentation is spotty. The dams themselves were usually abandoned in place. Removing them would have cost money with no return. Instead, companies simply stopped maintaining them. The structures rotted. They collapsed. They were overtopped by floods and washed away piece by piece. Today, you can still find remnants if you know where to look. Squared timbers embedded in stream banks, old rock cribs visible at low water, occasional iron spikes rusting in bedrock where cables were once anchored. These are the tombstones of an industry that fed American growth and American greed in equal measure. They mark graves that hold no bodies because the rivers took those long ago. The men who died in splash dam operations left few records. They were mostly young, mostly poor, mostly unmarried. They signed on with false names or no names at all. When they died, their partners might not know their real identities. Company records typically listed fatalities by job description rather than name. One entry might read, "River driver, drowned May 15th. Another might say, "Dam worker, crushed April 3rd. The human being behind these entries vanished into paperwork that nobody expected to keep. Occasionally, we get glimpses. Letters sent home before the drive season. Diary entries from literate workers. Newspaper obituaries for men with families who cared enough to place them. In 1888, a young man named James Corrigan wrote to his mother in Boston before beginning work on a splash dam in northern Maine. He described the operation in detail, including his concerns about the dam's construction. "The timbers don't look sound to me," he wrote, "but the boss says they'll hold, and he should know." 3 weeks later, the dam failed during a routine release. Corrigan was among 4 workers killed. His body was found 2 miles downstream, still wearing the leather apron he'd been issued for handling cables. His mother saved the letter. A historical society preserved it. And so we know James Corrigan existed, worried about safety, and died when his worries proved justified. He was 23 years old. For every James Corrigan whose story survived, hundreds of others vanished completely. They walked into the woods as living men. They came out as statistics, if they came out at all. Their names are gone. Their faces are gone. Only the work they did remains, visible in the damage that still marks the rivers they gave their lives to change. The end of splash and knee damming didn't mean the end of dangerous logging. The profession remained lethal throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. But splash dams represented something particular. A moment when American industry looked at rivers as machines to be operated and men as parts to be replaced. The philosophy wasn't unique to logging. It defined the entire industrial revolution. Human lives were cheaper than engineering solutions. Safety measures cost money that cut into profits. Workers who complained could be replaced by workers who wouldn't. What made splash dams exceptional was the scale of destruction they enabled. Other dangerous jobs killed workers one at a time. A splash dam could kill a dozen in a moment. Other industries damaged local environments. Splash dams reshaped entire watersheds, and they did it all with remarkable efficiency. The timber industry moved billions of board feet using splash dams. They built American cities and American railroads and American farms. The wood from splash dam operations became the houses your great-grandparents lived in, the furniture they sat on, the churches where they prayed. That wood carried a price that wasn't reflected in any ledger. It carried the price of men's lives and rivers' health and communities' futures. We paid that price without knowing it, and the debt remains uncollected. When you walk into an old house today, one built before 1920 or so, run your hand along the woodwork. Feel the grain. That might be old-growth timber from the splash dam era. That might be wood that cost a man his life to transport. You're touching history written in material that outlasted the men who moved it. The timber barons who owned the logging companies became some of the wealthiest Americans of their era. They built mansions and endowed universities and had their names carved into buildings that still stand. The workers who made that wealth possible left no monuments. Their names appear on no buildings. Their contributions are acknowledged nowhere except in the scars they left on the rivers. There is a mathematics to industrial death that we don't like to think about. So many men died to move so much timber to build so many houses. The equation can be calculated. The answer is uncomfortable. We are living in the dividend of sacrifices we never witnessed and can never repay. Today, you can visit rivers that once ran thick with splash dam drives. They look peaceful now. The water is clear. Fish are returning to some of them, slowly, after decades of restoration work. But if you know what to look for, you can see the scars. Stream channels that are too wide for their water volume. Banks that lack the old-growth vegetation that should anchor them. Pools that are too shallow, filled with gravel that should have been flushed downstream a century ago. The rivers remember what was done to them. They're still trying to recover. And if you listen carefully, if you stand in the right place at the right time, you might hear something else. The old-timers claimed you could hear the splash dams at night, a rumble like distant thunder, the roar of water and wood that echoed through the valleys long after the dams were gone. It's probably just the wind in the trees, probably just water flowing over rocks, probably just imagination fed by too many stories. But sometimes, on quiet nights in the old logging valleys, you have to wonder. Those men spent their lives fighting rivers and gravity and logs that weighed more than horses. They worked with tools that would be considered crude today and skills that would be considered impossible. They knew they might die, and they showed up anyway because the alternative was a different kind of death in a different kind of poverty. They weren't heroes in the way we usually use that word. They didn't volunteer for danger out of noble purpose. They took the work because it paid and they needed to eat. They risked their lives because that's what the job required. And walking away meant admitting defeat to an economy that didn't care whether they lived or died. But there is something heroic in that, in doing the work anyway, in walking out onto the jam when everyone knows it might break, in cutting the rope that releases the flood and running like your life depends on it because it does, in coming back season after season to a job that has already killed your friends. We owe them something more than forgetting. The rivers they destroyed are healing. Slowly. The forests they cut have regrown, mostly. The industry they served has evolved beyond recognition, thankfully. But the men themselves remain where they fell. In the rivers, in the valleys, in the shadow of wooden dams that could flood valleys on command. They built America, log by log, surge by surge, life by life. The least we can do is remember how much it cost. If you made it this far, you're not here for casual entertainment. You're here because stories like this matter. The forgotten workers, the impossible engineering, the price of progress that nobody talks about. I cover these stories every week. The history that doesn't make it into textbooks. The workers who built America and died doing it. The technology that seems impossible until you understand what people were willing to sacrifice. Subscribe if you want more. There's a video on screen right now about another piece of forgotten infrastructure that cost more lives than anyone recorded. These stories deserve to be told. These men deserve to be remembered. I'll see you in the next one.